The radio crackled with static before the voice cut through, sharp and urgent. All units, we have a situation at Firebase Kestrel. Multiple hostiles inbound, air support compromised. Repeat, air support compromised. The operations center went silent. Every officer present knew what compromised meant. It meant someone wasn't coming back. It meant the birds were grounded, the mechanics were scrambling, and the soldiers on that firebase were alone. Colonel Marcus then stood at the tactical display, his jaw working overtime on a piece of gum that had lost its flavor 3 hours ago. His eyes traced the red indicators blinking on the screen, each one representing a life that depended on decisions made in this room. He looked at the roster of available aircraft. Nothing. Every Apache, every Black Hawk, every piece of rotary wing machinery worth a damn was either in the air already or down for critical maintenance. His operations officer, Captain Rodriguez, was already on the phone with the neighboring base. The answer came back negative. They were fighting their own fires tonight. Then someone mentioned her. The Custodian. That's what they called her, though never to her face anymore. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Thorne had been pushing papers and managing hangar logistics for the better part of 2 years. Once, she'd been more. Once, she'd flown combat missions over hostile territory with a precision that made grown men weep with relief. But that was before the incident, before the inquiry, before the quiet reassignment that everyone understood meant she'd been shelved. Venn had inherited her when he took command, and he'd left her exactly where his predecessor had placed her, managing inventory and maintenance schedules. She was capable enough at it, he supposed, but it seemed a waste. Or maybe it was exactly where someone like her belonged after what happened. The thing was, nobody talked about what actually happened. The file was classified, redacted in places that mattered, and the people who knew weren't talking. All Venn knew was that Thorne had been flying a rescue mission. Things had gone sideways, and when the dust settled, she was grounded. Not discharged, not court-martialed, just grounded. There was a difference, and that difference lived in the gray spaces of military justice where politics and optics mattered more than truth. Now Firebase Kestrel was burning, and the only bird that might possibly fly sat in Hangar 7, an A-64 Apache that had been scheduled for decommission next month. It was old, worn, and had been cannibalized for parts to keep the newer models flying. And the only person who knew that aircraft inside and out, who had spent the last 8 months keeping it barely functional out of something that looked like stubbornness or pride, was Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Thorne. Venn stared at the tactical display and made a decision that felt like surrender. He found her in Hangar 7, exactly where he expected. The massive space smelled of hydraulic fluid, metal shavings, and that particular brand of military coffee that could strip paint. Thorne was underneath the Apache, her uniform sleeves rolled up, grease staining her forearms. A work lamp cast harsh shadows across the hangar floor. She didn't look up when his boots echoed across the concrete. She knew someone was there, but rank had stopped mattering to her in the same way it mattered to everyone else. When you'd been sidelined, the whole hierarchy became background noise. Venn cleared his throat. She still didn't look up. He could see her hands working, methodical and sure, tightening something in the landing gear assembly. Her brown hair was pulled back in a regulation bun that had come slightly loose, and there was a smudge of oil on her left cheek. She looked exactly like what she was, a mechanic, a logistics officer, someone who had traded the sky for the ground and learned to live with it. Thorne, Venn said, his voice carrying authority he wasn't sure he felt. She slid out from under the aircraft on a wheeled creeper, her gray eyes meeting his without warmth or hostility, just a flatness that unsettled him more than anger would have. She was 34, though she looked older in this light. Combat did that. So did being forgotten. "Sir," she said, the word technically correct but empty of deference. She sat up, wiping her hands on a rag that was already beyond saving. Behind her, the Apache loomed like a sleeping predator, all angles and weapon systems, and the kind of brutal efficiency that only military aviation could produce. This particular bird had a name stenciled near the cockpit, faded now but still visible. Revenant. Venn had never asked about the name. Now didn't seem like the time to start. Firebase Kestrel is under attack, he said, watching her face for any reaction. There was none. We have no air support available, everything's engaged or grounded. Thorne stood slowly, her eyes never leaving his. She knew what was coming. He could see it in the way her shoulders squared, the way her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This bird, he gestured at the Apache behind her, can it fly? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Thorne looked back at the helicopter, and for a moment something passed across her face. Memory, maybe, or calculation. She walked around the Apache slowly, her hand trailing along the fuselage like she was reading Braille. The aircraft was a patchwork of repairs, different panels showing the scars of emergency maintenance. It had been beautiful once, in the way weapons of war could be beautiful. Now it was survival, held together by skill and determination, and the stubborn refusal to let something die just because the paperwork said it should. Thorne stopped at the nose, looking up at the sensor array. Mechanically, yes, she said finally. Her voice was steady, the voice of someone who knew machinery better than people. The turbines are solid. I rebuilt the transmission 2 months ago when supply said we couldn't get replacement parts. The weapon systems are functional, though the ammunition load is going to be whatever we have on hand, which isn't much. She turned back to Vin, and he saw the question in her eyes before she asked it. But you're not asking if it can fly, Colonel. You're asking if I can fly it. There it was, the thing neither of them wanted to say directly. Vin felt the weight of command pressing down on his shoulders. Behind him, somewhere in the night, soldiers were fighting and dying. The math was simple and terrible. The base is 20 minutes out, he said, which wasn't an answer but was answer enough. They need gun support, extraction cover, and someone who won't fold when it gets hot. Thorne's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Old muscle memory, maybe. The part of her that had never really stopped being a combat pilot, that had just learned to live quietly in the background. You're asking me to take a decommissioned aircraft into a hot LZ with no support, no backup, and no official clearance, she said. It wasn't a question. Vin nodded. I am. She looked at him for a long moment, and he wondered what she was seeing. A commander making a desperate call. A man who had kept her grounded and was now using her because he had no other choice. Or maybe she wasn't thinking about him at all. Maybe she was thinking about the soldiers at Firebase Kestrel, about the way the radio had sounded when that call came in, about how it felt to be the one who needed help and knowing it might not come. I'll need a co-pilot gunner, she said. Just like that, the decision was made. Vin felt relief and guilt in equal measure. Rodriguez is pulling someone now, he said. You'll have 30 minutes to prep. Thorne nodded, already moving toward the equipment lockers where the flight suits were stored. Her movements were efficient, practiced, like she'd been waiting for this moment even though she probably thought it would never come. Vin watched her for a moment longer, then turned to leave. He'd made his call. Now he had to live with it. Behind him, the Apache waited in the shadows, and Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Thorne began the process of remembering what she'd been before they made her forget. The co-pilot gunner who arrived 15 minutes later was Warrant Officer James Cade, a 26-year-old with 3 combat tours and a reputation for staying calm under fire. He was good, maybe even excellent, but he'd never flown with Thorne. Nobody had, not in 2 years. He found her in the cockpit already, running through pre-flight checks with a speed that suggested she'd never stopped doing them, not even in her mind. The instruments glowed green and amber in the darkness, casting strange shadows across her face. Cade climbed into the front seat, the gunner's position, and strapped in. The cockpit smelled like old electronics and the particular metallic scent that came from weapon systems that had seen use. He could hear Thorne breathing steadily behind and above him, her hands moving across controls with the kind of confidence that couldn't be faked. Warrant Officer Cade, she said, her voice coming through the internal comms with crystal clarity. Welcome to Revenant. We're going to move fast, hit hard, and get those soldiers out. You stay with me, follow my calls, and we'll all go home tonight. There was no bravado in her voice, no false courage, just simple statement of intent. Cade keyed his mic. Understood, Commander. What's our weapons load? He watched his displays come online, the targeting systems initializing with soft electronic chirps. 16 Hellfire missiles, half capacity on the 30mm chain gun, and whatever luck we can manufacture, Thorne replied. Her hands continued their dance across the controls, muscle memory from thousands of hours asserting itself. The bird's old, but she's mean. Treat her right and she'll bring us back. Outside the hangar, ground crew were scrambling to clear the space. Someone had managed to scrounge up the ordnance, loading it onto the Apache's stub wings with the kind of urgency that came from knowing people were dying while you worked. The whole base had woken up now, word spreading that the Custodian was flying again. Some watched with curiosity, others with something like skepticism, a few with hope. Thorne didn't see any of it. She was already gone, already in the space between ground and sky, where nothing mattered except the machine and the mission. The turbines spooled up with a rising whine that became a roar, the whole aircraft shuddering as power coursed through systems that hadn't felt this alive in months. Thorne's hands were steady on the controls, her eyes scanning instruments with practiced efficiency. This was different from maintenance checks. This was waking something up, calling it back to purpose. "Tower, this is Revenant requesting immediate departure clearance," she said into the radio, her voice cutting through the standard traffic with authority that hadn't been there when she was managing inventory. There was a pause. Someone in the tower was checking, confirming, probably arguing. Then Colonel Ven's voice came through, overriding everything. "Revenant, you are cleared for immediate departure. Godspeed." Thorne didn't respond with the standard acknowledgement. She pulled collective, added cyclic, and the Apache lifted from the hangar floor like it had been waiting for this moment. The aircraft rose smoothly, despite its age, despite the patches and repairs, despite everything. It rose because Evelyn Thorne told it to, and some part of the machine remembered what it was supposed to be. They cleared the base perimeter at 100 knots and climbing, the night air rushing past the canopy. Below, the lights of the compound fell away, replaced by the vast darkness of hostile territory. Cade watched his displays, his hands ready on the weapon's controls. He'd heard the stories about Thorne, the fragments and rumors that circulated in the way military gossip always did. Some said she'd frozen under fire. Others said she'd disobeyed orders. A few claimed she'd saved her entire unit but gotten blamed for it anyway because someone needed to take the fall. Nobody knew for sure, and that uncertainty made her into something between cautionary tale and ghost story. Now he was flying with that ghost, heading into combat, and all he had to go on was the steady confidence in her voice, and the way this old Apache was responding like it was brand new. They flew low, using terrain to mask their approach. Thorne navigated by instinct and instruments, her hands making constant tiny adjustments that kept them in the sweet spot between detectable and suicidal. Firebase Kestrel appeared on their sensors before they saw it with their eyes, a cluster of heat signatures surrounded by the chaotic bloom of combat. Tracer fire lit up the night like deadly fireworks, and Cade could see the perimeter being probed from multiple directions. The firebase was a temporary installation, little more than reinforced positions and supply dumps, but it held a strategic position that made it worth defending, or worth dying for, depending on your perspective. "Revenant to Kestrel Actual, we are 2 minutes out coming in from the northwest. Give me target priorities." Thorne's voice was all business now, the calm center of the storm. The response came back immediately, and Cade could hear the relief mixed with desperation. "Revenant, Kestrel Actual. We have 3 technical vehicles with mounted weapons at coordinates Mike 74, heavy small arms fire from the ridge line to our east, and what looks like a mortar team setting up 600 meters south. We are taking casualties and low on ammunition. Please advise you are cleared hot on all targets." Thorne didn't acknowledge with words. She banked the Apache hard left, dropping altitude until they were skimming treetops, and Cade felt his stomach lurch with the sudden maneuver. She was good, better than good. The way she flew was like watching someone speak a language they'd thought they'd forgot, only to discover it had been there all along, waiting. "Cade, you have the technicals," she said calmly. "I'm putting you in position now. Take your time, make them count. And there they were, 3 pickup trucks with heavy machine guns mounted in the beds, tearing across the open ground toward the firebase perimeter. Cade's targeting reticle slid across his display as Thorne positioned the Apache perfectly, giving him the angle he needed. His finger found the trigger for the 30mm chain gun. The weapon system responded with a sound like the world tearing apart, shells streaming into the night. The first technical exploded, then the second. The third tried to evade, but Thorne anticipated the move, adjusting their position with such precision that Cade's targeting barely shifted. The third technical disintegrated under the chain gun's fury, metal and fire blooming against the dark landscape. Cade heard himself breathing hard, the adrenaline of combat hitting his system like voltage. But Thorne's breathing remained steady, unchanged, like this was just another day, like she'd never left this life at all. "Good shooting," she said, already banking toward the ridge line where muzzle flashes marked enemy positions. "Now let's clear that ridge before they bring up anything heavier." The Apache climbed and turned, a predator adjusting its angle of attack. Below, soldiers at Firebase Kestrel were fighting harder now, knowing they weren't alone anymore, knowing that someone had come. Thorne lined up on the ridge and Cade saw the targeting solution appear on his display. But before he could fire, she called out, "Hold," her voice sharp. Cade froze, finger hovering over the trigger. On his display, he saw it, the heat signature that didn't match the others. Civilian, maybe, or a friendly unit that had gotten separated. In the chaos of night combat, it would have been easy to miss. Easy to fire and realize the mistake too late. "Good catch," Cade said quietly, adjusting his aim. The other targets on the ridge lit up under the chain gun a moment later, the enemy position suppressed in seconds. Thorne banked away, already looking for the mortar team. She found them attempting to relocate, their heat signatures clear against the cooler ground. "2 Hellfires," she said. "Mark your targets." Cade designated the positions and felt the aircraft shudder as the missiles left their rails. They tracked through the night like falling stars in reverse, finding their targets with the inevitability of mathematics. The explosions lit up the landscape and the mortar threat disappeared from their sensors. "Kestrel actual immediate threat neutralized," Thorne transmitted. "What's your status?" The response came back, and this time there was something different in the voice. Not just relief, but respect. "Revenant, you just saved our lives. We have wounded that need immediate extraction. Can you provide cover for our dust-off?" Thorne was already scanning their fuel levels, ammunition count, and the surrounding terrain for additional threats. The math was tight, tighter than Cade was comfortable with, but she didn't hesitate. "Affirmative, Kestrel. Medical helicopter is inbound from base, ETA 15 minutes. We'll maintain overwatch." She brought the Apache into a circling pattern above the firebase, high enough to maintain visibility but low enough to respond quickly to any new threats. The night had gone quiet again, the kind of quiet that came after violence, when everyone who was still alive was trying to process what had just happened. Cade watched his sensors, looking for any sign of additional hostile movement. Behind him, Thorne flew with the same steady precision, her hands making constant small adjustments to keep their patrol pattern perfect. "Commander," Cade said, the question forming before he could stop it. "What happened? Before, I mean. Why did they ground you?" The silence that followed was long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, quietly, she said, "I made a choice." That was all she gave him, and somehow it was enough. Because in combat, choices were everything. The difference between saving lives and ending them, between following orders and following conscience, between the mission and the people. Sometimes those things aligned. Sometimes they didn't. And when they didn't, someone had to decide what mattered more. The medical helicopter arrived on schedule, a black hawk with red crosses visible even in the darkness. Thorne maintained position, keeping the Apache between the extraction bird and any possible threat vectors. The wounded were loaded quickly, professional efficiency born from too much practice. When the Black Hawk lifted off, Thorne fell in behind it, providing escort until they were clear of the danger zone. Only then did she turn the Apache back toward base, the mission complete, her fuel gauge showing numbers that suggested they'd cut it very close indeed. Colonel Venn was waiting on the tarmac when they landed, along with half the command staff and what looked like every off-duty soldier who'd heard what happened. Thorne shut down the Apache systems methodically, the turbines winding down with a descending whine. She sat in the cockpit for a moment longer than necessary, her hands resting on controls that felt like they'd always belonged there. Then she opened the canopy and climbed out, her flight suit dark with sweat, her face streaked with the grime that came from flying hard. Venn approached, and Cade watched from a distance as the colonel extended his hand. Thorne looked at it for a moment, then shook it once, firmly. Words were exchanged, too quiet for Cade to hear, but he saw the colonel's expression. It wasn't apology exactly, but it was recognition. Acknowledgement that maybe they'd gotten something wrong, keeping her grounded. That maybe the incident, whatever it had been, deserved a second look. Or maybe it just meant that desperation had forced them to see what they'd been trying to ignore. Either way, Thorne didn't seem to care much about the attention. She walked away from the crowd, back toward Hangar 7, back toward the place where she'd been living for 2 years in a kind of exile. But something had changed. The soldiers who watched her pass didn't see the Custodian anymore. They saw what she actually was, a pilot, a warrior, someone who'd answered the call when it mattered most. Cade caught up with her at the hangar entrance. "Commander," he said, and she paused. "That was some of the best flying I've ever seen. Thank you for bringing us back." She looked at him, and for the first time he saw something other than that flat, controlled expression. Not quite a smile, but close. "Get some rest, warrant officer," she said. "Tomorrow we have to tear down this whole bird and rebuild it. Can't let the decommission paperwork catch up with us." It was a joke, sort of, and Cade found himself grinning. The next morning, Firebase Kestrel sent a formal commendation through channels. Every soldier who'd been there that night signed it, from the lowest private to the Firebase commander. They wanted it known that Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Thorne had saved their lives with skill, courage, and the kind of flying that most of them had only heard about in stories. The commendation landed on Colonel Venn's desk along with his morning briefing, and he read it twice before setting it down. His operations officer, Captain Rodriguez, stood on the other side of the desk waiting. "Sir," Rodriguez said carefully, "about Commander Thorne's status." Venn knew what was coming. The question had been building since last night, since the moment that old Apache had lifted off, and everyone had been reminded of what Thorne actually was when you let her fly. He looked at the commendation again, at the name signed at the bottom. Then he looked at the classified file that he'd pulled from his safe that morning, the one about the incident that had gotten Thorne grounded. He'd read it through 3 times now, looking for something he'd missed. The official story was that Thorne had deviated from her assigned mission profile during a rescue operation. She'd been ordered to provide cover for a convoy extraction, but had instead diverted to assist a pinned-down infantry unit that wasn't part of her tasking. The decision had worked out. Both groups had survived, but it had been a direct violation of orders. The inquiry had focused on the chain of command, on the precedent it set, on the importance of following mission parameters even when circumstances changed. Thorne had accepted the reprimand without appealing, which had seemed like an admission of guilt at the time. Now, reading the file again with fresh context, Venn saw it differently. She hadn't appealed because she'd made the choice consciously. She'd weighed the orders against the reality on the ground and decided that saving the infantry unit mattered more than following the script. She'd been right, tactically. The convoy would have made it out either way. But the infantry unit would have been overrun without her intervention. The problem was that being right tactically didn't always align with being right procedurally, and the military ran on procedure. Someone higher up the chain had decided to make an example, to remind pilots that they didn't get to choose their missions based on personal judgment. So Thorne had been shelved, parked in logistics where her skills wouldn't be wasted entirely, but where she also wouldn't be in a position to make those kinds of calls again. It had seemed reasonable at the time. Now it seemed like institutional cowardice dressed up as discipline. "Sir," Rodriguez prompted again, then closed the file. "Restore her flight status," he said. "Full clearance effective immediately, and pull the Apache from decommission. If Thorne says it can fly, then it flies. Rodriguez nodded, but there was something else in his expression. A question he wasn't sure how to ask. Venn answered it anyway. And schedule a review of the original incident. Not a formal appeal, just a review. Let's see if maybe we missed something important. The word spread through the base faster than any official announcement could travel. By noon, everyone knew that the Custodian was flying again. Some of the older pilots, the ones who'd served with Thorne before the incident, looked vindicated. They'd never believed she deserved to be grounded, but rank and politics had kept them from saying so too loudly. Now they didn't have to be quiet anymore. The younger pilots, the ones who'd only known her as the logistics officer who kept the hangars running, started asking questions. What had she been like in combat? Why had she been grounded? Was it true she'd once flown a damaged Apache for 40 minutes with one engine on fire? The stories multiplied and evolved, some true, some exaggerated, all of them building the legend that had been quietly dormant for 2 years. Thorne herself seemed unaware of or uninterested in the attention. She continued her work in Hangar 7, now officially assigned to restore the Apache to full operational status rather than prepare it for decommission. Cade volunteered to be her permanent co-pilot gunner, a request that was approved without hesitation. Other crew members started finding excuses to work near Hangar 7, to learn from watching her, to be part of whatever was happening there. Because something was happening, everyone could feel it. It wasn't just about one pilot getting her wings back. It was about the institution remembering that sometimes the rules existed to be questioned, that sometimes the person who broke formation was actually flying in the right direction. A week after the Firebase Kestrel mission, Thorne was in the hangar working on the Apache's avionics when a young pilot approached. Lieutenant Amy Matsuda, fresh from flight school, all polish and regulation and nervous energy. She stopped at a respectful distance, waiting to be acknowledged. Thorne didn't look up from her work immediately, but eventually she slid out from behind the panel she'd been adjusting and regarded the younger woman with those steady gray eyes. "Lieutenant," Thorne said, not unfriendly but not warm either, just neutral the way she approached most human interactions. Matsuda straightened, unconsciously coming to attention even though this wasn't a formal situation. "Commander, I wanted to ask. I mean, if you have time." She stumbled over the words, trying to find the right ones. Thorne waited patiently, the way you wait for machinery to cycle through its processes. Can't rush it, can only give it space to work. "I heard what you did at Firebase Kestrel," Matsuda finally said. "And I heard before about why you were grounded. I'm trying to understand. How do you know when to follow orders and when to?" She trailed off, the question too big and too dangerous to finish. But Thorne understood. She stood, wiping her hands on a rag, and looked at the younger pilot for a long moment. Then she walked over to the Apache, placing her hand on the fuselage. "This aircraft," she said quietly, "is a weapon system. It's designed to do specific things in specific ways, but it's also flown by people, and people have to make decisions that machinery can't. The orders you get are written by people who aren't here, who can't see what you see, who don't have your perspective." She turned back to Matsuda. "Most of the time, the orders are right. They're based on strategy and intelligence and resources you don't have access to. But sometimes, rarely, you're the person on the ground or in the air, and you see something that changes the equation. And in that moment, you have to decide if you're willing to be wrong on your own judgment instead of being wrong by following someone else's." It wasn't a satisfying answer, not really. It didn't provide a formula or a decision tree, but Matsuda seemed to understand that some questions didn't have clean answers, only the weight of responsibility and the hope that you'd measure up when it mattered. Thorne's flight status restoration became official at the end of the week, complete with a quiet ceremony that felt more like an acknowledgement than a celebration. Colonel then presented her with her wings again, the small pin that represented everything she'd lost and regained. She accepted them with a nod, pinned them to her uniform, and went back to work. The Apache, now officially designated for continued service, became her primary aircraft. She flew regular patrols, training missions, and twice more provided combat support when situations deteriorated faster than anyone anticipated. Each time, she performed with the same steady competence that had become her signature. Not flashy, not reckless, just devastatingly effective. Cade flew with her on every mission, learning her rhythms and her methods. He learned that she communicated in economy, never using 3 words when one would do. He learned that she trusted her crew completely, but verified everything herself anyway. He learned that she flew like someone who understood that the aircraft was an extension of human will, not a replacement for human judgment. Other pilots started requesting to fly training missions with her, to learn her techniques, to understand what made her different. Thorne accepted these requests with the same neutral professionalism she brought to everything, neither flattered nor annoyed, just focused on the work. She taught by demonstration more than explanation, showing younger pilots how to read terrain, how to position for maximum effectiveness, how to make the Apache do things that weren't in the manual because the manual couldn't account for every situation. Months passed. The incident at Firebase Kestrel faded from immediate memory, becoming just another story in a military that ran on stories. But the change in Thorne's status remained. She was no longer the custodian. She was Revenant again, the call sign she'd carried before the grounding, the name that had been stenciled on that old Apache like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. And somewhere in the files of the command structure, the review of her original incident concluded quietly. No formal announcement, no public reversal, just a note added to her record. The note stated that Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Thorne's actions during the contested rescue operation had been tactically sound and had resulted in 0 casualties across both mission groups. While the deviation from assigned tasking remained a procedural violation, the review board found that the decision reflected exceptional situational awareness and command judgment. The reprimand would remain on her record as a matter of documentation, but it would no longer be considered a factor in future advancement or assignment considerations. Venn read the review board's conclusion and filed it away. He thought about showing it to Thorne, then decided against it. She'd already moved forward. The paperwork was just the institution catching up to reality. Instead, he found himself in Hangar 7 one evening, watching Thorne work on the Apache's weapons systems. The bird was purring now, all its mechanical quirks resolved, maintained with a precision that bordered on reverence. "Commander," he said, and she paused in her work. "I wanted to apologize." Thorne looked at him, confused. "For what, sir?" Venn gestured vaguely, encompassing the hangar the Apache the last 2 years. "For not seeing what should have been obvious, for letting politics and procedure override common sense, for keeping you grounded when you should have been flying." She considered this for a moment, then shrugged slightly. "You were following orders too, Colonel, same as everyone, same as I should have that day." She turned back to her work, but Venn wasn't done. "The review came back," he said. "You were right. That infantry unit wouldn't have made it without you. Everyone knows it now." Thorne's hands stilled on the tools, and for a moment he thought she might say something. But when she spoke, her voice was steady, unchanged. "They made it. That's what matters. The rest is just noise." And that Venn realized was who she was. Someone who cared about the outcome more than the credit, about the mission more than the politics. A year after Firebase Kestrel, Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Thorne was promoted to commander and given charge of the entire Rotary Wing Combat Division. She accepted the promotion with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, then immediately started implementing changes to training protocols and maintenance procedures. She created new evaluation criteria that emphasized decision-making under pressure rather than just technical proficiency. She pushed for better communication systems between ground forces and air support. She fought the bureaucracy for resources with the same steady determination she'd used to keep that old Apache flying. And slowly, the division changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, but with the steady pressure of competence and commitment. Pilots who had been content to follow standard procedures started thinking more critically about their missions. Ground crews who had treated aircraft maintenance as routine started approaching it with the same attention to detail that Thorne demonstrated. The whole culture shifted, becoming sharper and more responsive. Other commands started noticing. Requests came in for Thorne to visit, to consult, to explain how her division had improved its performance metrics so significantly. She deflected most of these requests, preferring to stay with her unit, but occasionally she accepted invitations to speak at training schools or command colleges. Her presentations were direct and practical, focused on real situations rather than theory. She talked about fire-based Kestrel, about the decisions that had to be made in seconds, about the weight of responsibility that came with capability. And she talked about the Apache she'd refused to let die, about how sometimes the old systems still had value if you were willing to invest the effort to maintain them. The younger pilots loved her presentations. The senior officers found them challenging. Everyone understood that she was describing something important about leadership and judgment that couldn't be captured in regulations or standard operating procedures. She was describing what it meant to serve with integrity when the path wasn't clear. The Apache she'd flown that night at Firebase Kestrel, the one they'd almost decommissioned, remained in active service. It became something of a legend itself, the bird that had been brought back from the edge, just like its pilot. Other crews flew it on various missions, but it always came back to Hangar 7, always came back to Thorne's direct oversight. She continued to maintain it personally, refusing to delegate the work entirely, treating it with the kind of attention usually reserved for far more modern aircraft. Cade, now a chief warrant officer, still flew as her primary co-pilot gunner when she took the Apache up herself. They'd become an effective team, their communication reduced to the kind of shorthand that only came from shared experience and mutual trust. Other pilots joked that they were telepathic, but it was simpler than that. They just understood each other's rhythms and intentions. Years accumulated. The combat zone shifted, threats evolved, technology advanced. The old Apache finally did get decommissioned, not because it failed, but because it had simply given everything it had to give. Thorne was there when they flew it for the last time, a simple patrol mission that became something like a funeral for those who understood. When they landed, she ran her hand along the fuselage one final time, then walked away without looking back. Some things you couldn't keep forever, no matter how much you wanted to, but you could remember them. You could honor what they'd given. The name Revenant was transferred to a newer Apache, carrying the legacy forward. Thorne continued to fly, continued to command, continued to make the difficult choices that came with leadership. She never spoke much about Firebase Kestrel or the years she'd spent grounded. When younger officers asked about those times, she'd give them the same answer she'd given Matsuda years before, about making decisions and living with them. About being willing to be wrong on your own judgment rather than being wrong by blindly following orders. It wasn't a popular message in an institution built on hierarchy and compliance, but it was an honest one. Eventually, Commander Evelyn Thorne retired from active service. Her career measured not in medals or promotions, but in the lives she'd saved and the pilots she'd trained. The military gave her a formal ceremony, complete with speeches and honors and all the ritual that came with significant service. She endured it patiently, standing at attention while others talked about her contributions, her leadership, her legacy. When it was over and she could finally leave, she walked out of the ceremony hall and found Cade waiting by his car. "Need a ride, Commander?" he asked, grinning. She almost smiled. "I'm not a commander anymore, James, just Evelyn now." They drove away from the base together, two veterans who'd seen combat and survived it, who'd learned that the hardest battles weren't always the ones fought in the air. Sometimes they were fought in rooms full of officers, or in your own mind when you were trying to decide if the rules still applied when people's lives hung in the balance. Somewhere in a military archive, her file remained, complete with the commendations and the reprimand, the stellar performance reviews and the note about procedural violations. Anyone who read it carefully could see the story there, could understand that her career had been defined not by following the expected path but by having the courage to deviate when deviation mattered. But most people would never read that file. Instead, they'd hear the stories about the custodian who became revenant again, about the pilot who saved Firebase Kestrel when everyone thought air support was impossible, about the commander who changed how an entire division thought about flying and fighting, and the weight of command decisions. Those stories would be told in ready rooms and training schools, evolving and growing with each retelling, becoming the kind of legend that military culture created around its most important lessons. And at the center of those stories would be a simple truth that Evelyn Thorne had demonstrated through action rather than words. That truth was this: competence wasn't about following procedures perfectly or never making mistakes. It was about understanding that you were a human being with judgment and conscience, operating within systems that couldn't account for every possibility. It was about knowing when the rules served their purpose and when they got in the way of doing what was right. It was about being willing to bear the consequences of your choices because the alternative, letting other people's choices define your actions when you knew better, was a different kind of failure. Thorne had been grounded for making that choice once. She'd paid the price, accepted the consequences, and when given the chance to fly again, she'd done it without bitterness or hesitation. That willingness to engage fully despite past punishment, that refusal to become cynical or withdrawn, was maybe her greatest demonstration of character. Years after her retirement, young pilots still asked about her. What was she like? What made her different? How did she know when to break formation? The answers varied depending on who was telling the story, but they all circled around the same core understanding. Evelyn Thorne had been someone who understood that being a pilot wasn't just about technical skill. It was about carrying responsibility for the lives that depended on your decisions. It was about making those decisions with clear eyes and then living with the outcomes, whatever they might be. She'd been grounded because she chose people over procedure. She'd been restored because eventually even the institution recognized that sometimes that was exactly the right choice. Her legacy wasn't just in the missions she'd flown or the soldiers she'd saved. It was in the way she'd changed how people thought about command and judgment. She'd shown that you could be both disciplined and thoughtful, both obedient and independent, both a good soldier and a moral actor. Those things didn't have to be in conflict, even though they sometimes were. And when they were, you had to decide what kind of person you wanted to be. The old Apache that had carried her back into the sky that night at Firebase Kestrel eventually ended up in a military museum, restored and preserved as an example of the rotary wing aircraft that had served through multiple conflicts. A small plaque near the display told its story, including the night it had been pulled from near decommission to fly one more critical mission. The plaque mentioned Commander Evelyn Thorne by name, calling her an exemplary pilot and leader whose career demonstrated the importance of judgment and moral courage in military service. Visitors to the museum would stop and read the plaque, some of them recognizing the name, others learning it for the first time. Veterans would pause longer, perhaps remembering their own moments of decision, their own times when the rules and the right thing hadn't aligned perfectly. And somewhere in the spaces between the official history and the lived experience, Evelyn Thorne's story continued. Not because she'd been perfect or infallible, but because she'd been human. Because she'd understood that carrying authority meant carrying responsibility, and that responsibility sometimes required courage that had nothing to do with physical danger. The courage to stand alone if necessary. The courage to accept consequences for doing what you believed was right. The courage to come back after being knocked down and do the work anyway without bitterness, without resentment, with the same steady competence that had always defined her. That was the story. That was the legacy. Not a fairy tale about a hero who always won, but something more useful and more true. A story about someone who made hard choices, paid prices, and kept going because the work mattered more than her comfort or her pride. The kind of story that the military needed, even when it didn't always want to hear it. The kind of story that reminded everyone, from the newest recruit to the highest commander, that the uniform was supposed to mean something beyond just following orders. It was supposed to mean standing for something, fighting for something, being willing to sacrifice for something larger than yourself. And sometimes, in the complicated reality of military service, that meant standing against the institution itself when the institution lost sight of its purpose. Evelyn Thorne had done that. She'd paid for it. And then she'd been vindicated, not because she demanded it, but because reality had eventually made her correctness impossible to ignore. That pattern, that arc from punishment to redemption, was what made her story powerful. It said that the system could be wrong but could also correct itself. It said that individuals could make a difference even when the bureaucracy pushed back. It said that patience and competence and integrity could outlast politics and procedure. Those were messages that every generation of soldiers needed to hear, and so her story persisted, told and retold, simplified and complicated, but always centered on the same essential truth. When Commander Evelyn Thorne had looked at Firebase Kestrel burning and an old Apache that shouldn't fly, she'd made a choice. To try. To risk. To care more about the outcome than the safety of staying grounded. That choice had saved lives. But more than that, it had reminded everyone watching that the point of all the training and the hierarchy and the discipline wasn't to create perfect obedience. It was to create capable people who could make good decisions when the moment demanded it. And sometimes the best decision looked like disobedience from a distance, even though up close it was obvious that it was the only reasonable path. Thorne had walked that path twice, once when she'd been grounded for it, and once when she'd been celebrated. The consistency between those two moments, the fact that she'd made similar choices for similar reasons regardless of the consequences, that was what defined her. Not the outcomes, which were partly luck, but the character that produced those choices in the first place. And that character couldn't be taught from a manual or instilled through training alone. It had to be modeled, demonstrated, lived out loud so that others could see what it looked like in practice. That's what Evelyn Thorne had done, intentionally or not. She'd shown what it looked like to be a complete military professional. Skilled but not arrogant, disciplined but not rigid, obedient but not blind, courageous in ways that had nothing to do with physical bravery. Her legacy lived in the pilots who flew with more thoughtfulness because they'd learned from her example, in the commanders who made decisions with more moral clarity because they'd seen how she'd navigated impossible choices, in the institution itself, which was slightly better, slightly more willing to trust its people's judgment because she'd proven that sometimes trust was warranted. The Apache in the museum gathered dust slowly, its weapons systems deactivated, its turbines cold and still. But the name painted on its side, Revenant, remained visible. A reminder that some things could come back from the dead if you refused to let them die. That some stories didn't end where everyone expected. That redemption was real, even in an institution not known for forgiveness. And that sometimes the person everyone had written off, the one assigned to manage inventory and push papers, was actually exactly who you needed when everything fell apart.